All right, tech enthusiasts, my time with the madVR Envy continues, and one of the most talked about elements, comments, feedback that I had to the first look, first take unboxing video had to do with how exactly do you connect this thing into a home theater system? What's the HDMI port configuration on the madVR, on the Envy? How does it work? How do I use it? What does it mean to have it installed in my system? So I answered a bunch of questions about that, and we had some discussion in the comments of the last video, but I want to dig in and kind of round out the whole discussion of it right here. All right, so let's go. First of all, what does it mean to have the madVR installed in a system, or how did I install it particularly in my system? Very simply, I have two video sources in my home theater setup, Apple TV and Kaleidoscape. Both of those are HDMI input into my Anthem AVM90. The AVM90 goes HDMI out to the madVR Envy's input, and then the Envy's output goes to the projector in the theater room. If you look at the madVR Envy, what you'll find is that it has exactly 3 HDMI ports on it. There's an output that lives on the GPU that's in the system itself, and there's a secondary card that has 2 HDMI ports on it. One is the input, and one is what they call a pass-through output. We'll talk more about the pass-through and why you would use that in a little bit. Suffice to say that installing this thing was really a piece of cake. I literally just unplugged the HDMI that went from the 90 to the projector, and instead plugged that cable into the output of the Envy, grabbed another HDMI cable, a 6-foot regular cable, just like the ones I use throughout all of my AV setups, and connected that one between the 90 and the madVR. So the important takeaway there is that the madVR is the last device in the video chain before the display. That's how they designed it, that's how they built the port configurations, and that's how it's meant to be connected in your system. Part and parcel with that, the Envy is not made to act like an HDMI switch. It's not meant to take a bunch of HDMI sources directly into it and then pass that signal down through the rest of your system. The other thing that was asked about or noted is that the Envy doesn't have an audio-only HDMI output, meaning you're not taking, again, your disparate video sources into the Envy and then sending one HDMI to the display and one HDMI to your receiver or your preamp. It doesn't have the ports to do that. In my opinion, I kind of quite like the way that this sets up in the system, and this is my preferable way to have a video processor running in my system regardless. So I'll say as well that I don't miss any of those extra ports not being present on the Envy. I wouldn't want to split video and audio. I like being able to see the volume and menu overlays of my Anthem on my screen when I change volume and when I'm using it. I like to see the overlay when it pops up when the sound format changes, so I can specifically see it say Dolby Atmos. If you split the audio and video, you lose that information. You lose the ability for the AVR or the preamp to inject that overlay. We already have really capable video HDMI switching in a lot of our preamplifiers and receivers available nowadays, and Anthem literally has amongst the best HDMI switching out there. Something like 7 input ports on the AVM90, and they're all a full 48 HDMI 2.1. So to me, this is the way I like it. This is the way that I would want to use it, and I don't consider the Envy not having those ports to be some kind of a deficiency. One of the reasons that you may actually perhaps want to have multiple inputs into something like a video processor is because maybe perhaps in your setup you want to have a set of discrete configuration per input device. You would want the video processor to do something different with the Apple TV versus what it does with the Kaleidoscape. If those connections to the video processor were discrete hardware ports, and of course the software allowed you to do it, yes, you could make individual configurations per each of those source devices. But the Envy, despite not having multiple HDMI inputs, doesn't need HDMI inputs to be able to achieve device-specific or source-specific configurations. The software in the Envy has something that they call profiles, and you can have different device source profiles You can name them what you want. You can save different settings and behaviors to each of those profiles. And very easily with some clicks of the button of the remote or an automation system like Control 4, I can essentially put the Envy into a mode that would be an Apple TV mode or a Kaleidoscope mode or a Blu-ray player mode or whatever it may be. So what it maybe doesn't have in terms of hardware ports, it makes up entirely in terms of the functionality with software. Now, any discussion of the madVR Envy inevitably brings into discussion comparisons to the Lumagen, and so let's talk about that for a second, because there are some specific differences in engineering and choice between the devices with regards to connections and switching and hardware ports and features. The Lumagen is available in a variety of different configurations, having multiple HDMI inputs and multiple HDMI outputs. You can buy a Lumagen that has several HDMI inputs, and most of the Lumagen models have multiple HDMI outputs, including some that are made to go to the display and then an audio only port and all of that. So when it comes to some of that hardware connectivity configurability, the Lumagen gives you a little bit more flexibility. Yes, you can do the switching of multiple devices in the Lumagen. Yes, you can do that splitting if you really want to discretely route your video and your audio signal. So for somebody that maybe has a very specific system need where those hardware ports are a required element of what you're trying to accomplish in your system, well, then there is a bit of a nod to the Lumagen in that regard. The downside to that, of course, is you're going to pay for those ports. Lumagen is available in a variety of different models, but the more ports you have, the more expensive of the model of the Lumagen that you're basically going to have to buy. And in fact, when I demoed the Lumagen last year and I was considering purchasing one, my operative choice in the Lumagen lineup would have been to give me the device that has the fewest number of ports possible, because I don't feel any specific need to pay for all these HDMI inputs or even multiple HDMI outputs for that matter. As stated, I don't want to do an audio video split, and I only really have 2 video sources unless I also connect some gaming sources. We'll talk about gaming in a minute, but fundamentally I only have 2 video sources, and in that regard I don't really feel much of a need to change configurations or behaviors between what I want a video processor to do for an Apple TV versus a Kaleidoscope. Better off just buying the less expensive unit and saving the difference. So let's talk about gaming for a little bit, because that's where I think some of the connectivity complication comes into play when we start talking about video processors. So if you have a gaming source device, a Nintendo Switch, a PlayStation, an Xbox, or a high-end gaming PC like I have up here on top of my rack, one of the biggest elements to enjoying gaming has to do with input latency, right? As a gamer, we want the response to what we're inputting, pressing buttons on our controller, moving sticks and moving our characters. We want that input translated to the screen with as little minimal latency as possible. The lower the level of latency, the higher the level of a response. Effectively, the better of a gamer we all are. And if you're playing anything remotely online, multiplayer, competitive, then that's going to be really important to you. But even then, I don't do much of that stuff anymore. But I can definitely tell a difference playing a high refresh, very low latency gaming setup versus one that's not. In fact, changing from my Sony LED television to my G2 OLED actually made it so that I could win races playing Hot Wheels Unleashed with my son. I could win races on the LG that I couldn't win on the Sony, because just input to taking corners and accelerating and braking is so tight. It really made that much of a difference in my completing the game and in winning some aspects of the game. So the other element to keep in mind is that video processing, by and large, is a computationally intensive process. There's a reason that we have like this big old device, right, with all of this GPU and CPU compute power doing things to the images that are coming in to create the images that are going out. You can't do that in zero time. It adds latency, and there's some lag there. So you wouldn't want to game necessarily through a video processor. And I know some of the folks out there will say, ultimately, I think the madVR Envy has a bit more latency added than a Lumagen. Some people do game on their Lumagens. I don't know specifically what level of additional delay a Lumagen adds versus doesn't add. In my setup though, I just would have no desire to put a gaming system through a video processor, regardless of what it is, brand, make, or model. So let's just say in this setup here, I also added a PlayStation. I could route that PlayStation as another HDMI input into the AVM90. The AVM90 could continue to connect in to the madVR, but now I would want to take advantage of using the pass-through HDMI output. And what that means is there would be two HDMI lines running out of the NV to the projector. The regular processed video output would go to the projector's HDMI 1 input, and the pass-through output of the NV would go to HDMI 2 on the projector. When I'm watching video sources like the Apple TV or Kaleidoscape, I would have my system configured to put the projector on HDMI 1. When I'm using a gaming source like that PlayStation or PC, I would configure my system to put the projector into HDMI 2. And I would very deliberately in the projector then have a pretty significant difference in terms of setup, settings, and configurations between the two. HDMI 1 would be completely and properly set up to interact with and properly engage with the NV doing all of that video processing, heavy lifting work. And HDMI 2 would be relying solely on the projector to do its processing. We would want to make sure that the projector is in its low latency game modes and other things like that. Now, one other thing to consider is I could still accomplish that in my system, and I don't even have to use the video processor to do it. If you look at a high-end preamp or a reasonably high-end receiver nowadays, a lot of times you're going to actually have two HDMI outputs that go to the main zone, and they're essentially mirror images of each other. Same information, same signal being passed through the preamp and out both of those outputs. So instead of even using the pass-through output of the madVR, I could in fact have the AVM90 send its first main zone HDMI out into the madVR and on to the projector's HDMI 1, and I could just take the second HDMI main zone output of the AVM90 and take that directly to the projector's HDMI 2 input. Now there are some more nuances there because you're going to have to deal potentially with different HDMI identifiers, EDIDs, and so on. And so in some respects, maybe HDMI could be more reliable if you take both outputs from the madVR instead of one from the madVR and one from the AVM90. But ultimately, I think it's probably like 6 of one, half dozen of another. I don't have my system set up that way right now, but I do intend to do that. I very much want to do that for a variety of other testing reasons as well. And I have another long HDMI fiber optic cable sitting right over here. Maybe one of this coming weekends or whatnot, I'll finally pull that cable and I'll have 2 runs and I can experiment some more with this and report back on to how well it works kind of one way or the other. But the fundamental takeaway for me is that I would want to bypass a video processor with a gaming source, regardless, I think, of what video processor I may be using. And there's a couple of different choices and options and ways to do that. And I do appreciate then having a pass-through HDMI output port on the NV itself. I think it probably is also worth noting that the higher model, the 5000 series of the Lumagen, they do advertise or market the idea that it does perform some audio processing meant to do things like reduce jitter and improve the reliability of the audio signal passing through it. That may be a reason that you would actually want to have a Lumagen in the processing chain ahead of both your display and also ahead of your audio processor preamp receiver. In some situations, in some content, maybe that may make a bigger difference. As of now, with its current feature set, the NV is not doing anything. It doesn't want to do anything with regards to audio. And so there's a very deliberate reason then that the madVR NV installation instructions have us putting this processor further down the system chain between the audio system and the display. More and more nowadays as well, I think it's worth noting, I feel like I'm condensing HDMI sources. I have far less HDMI sources, video sources than I used to have in the past. Longer ago, we had cable boxes and potentially a type of streamer box and a local media player and a Blu-ray player and multiple game consoles. I'm pretty well condensed now to 2 video sources in my setup, with the Apple TV being my streamer, my media player, and my cable box, and then supplementing that with the Kaleidoscape, A single PC nowadays is functional as both an Xbox and a PlayStation effectively. So all in all, I've been on a path and a roadmap of trying to reduce my devices, reduce the need and volume of switching and distribution and other things and complexities like that. And one other final thought that I do want to note is if you are using a preamplifier or a receiver to route a second HDMI somewhere, please make sure that you're looking at the outputs on your preamplifier to find that you have two outputs for the main zone. What you may find on some models is that you have a single output for the main zone, but then you may have like a zone 2 HDMI. You don't want to be taking a main zone output and a zone 2 output and then routing them to the same display device or two different display devices that are actually in the same zone. Zone 2 is meant to go somewhere else, and it changes some of the logistics of the video and audio that is sent there and the power management and the switching and all of that. I actually do use the Zone 2 power of my AVM90 because I use it to distribute the signal from my kaleidoscope to both the theater and to my living room. My living room is the Zone 2 from the AVM90's perspective. The theater is Zone 1. So be careful that you're not conflating multiple main zone HDMI outputs with multi-zone or Zone 2 HDMI outputs. They have a much different purpose. So again, hope this clears some things up. If it brings up more questions for you, post in the comments and let's discuss. Of course, if you're shopping any of this awesome stuff, you want to buy yourself a madVR Envy Extreme, check out my affiliates, my friends, at my business partners at Audio Advice. They have all the models, the upgrades, and can provide excellent service and support for madVR and a whole host of other home theater gear as well. There are also other affiliates linked down in the description. Amazon, Best Buy, Target, and more. If you're doing your shopping and you want to support me, please do. Become a channel member, PayPal, Venmo, tips, super thanks, and all of that is down there. Thanks so much for watching. Please do all that regular YouTube stuff. Like, subscribe, hit the bell, share the video. Leave a comment, let's discuss, and come on back for more home theater discussion and fun.